happy to be able to welcome to PCJ leaders from Roca Incorporated. Roca seeks out young people who are at risk of engaging in violent acts, engages them in meaningful relationships that build trust, offers them opportunities to learn a skill set and competencies that might lead to behavioral change, and it supports them in living into their own dreams. It's an approach that works, and Chris Judd and Carl Miranda will join us today to explain how. Christine Judd, or Chris, is the director of Roca Springfield and Holyoke. Since 2011, Chris has been leading Roca's work with high-risk young men and mothers in Western Massachusetts. As the director there, Chris oversees the Roca's high-risk young men, which focuses on young people who are deeply involved in the criminal justice system and are not ready, willing, or able to participate in any other program or jobs. She led the program through major expansions, including the opening of the high-risk young mothers program in Western Massachusetts in 2017. A part of Chris's role is building partnerships with community justice and law enforcement partners, including the Springfield and Holyoke police departments, city administrations, the courts, probation services, Hampden County DA's office, the Hampden County Sheriff's Department, etc. In collaboration with these partners, she leads county-wide work to improve justice outcomes for young adults, with specific efforts to improve public safety. She leads a staff of 30 people and oversees Roca's work in Western Massachusetts to prepare young people for the job market, including workforce development activities, a transitional employment program, pre-vocational trainings, and work with employers across the region. Chris has earned a master's in education from Endicott College and her BA from Our Lady of the Elms. Joining Chris is Carl Miranda. Carl is the director of Roca in Boston. As a Salvadoran immigrant who spent his formative years in South Central Los Angeles in the 1980s, and as a professional who has worked for many years in urban environments in frontline and management capacities, Carl understands the kind of struggles that young adults face in urban environments with poverty, trauma, and challenging relationships with law enforcement. Carl holds a BA from UC Berkeley, go Bears, although in ethnic studies and rhetoric as opposed to sociology, but I'm not gonna hold it against him. He also has a master's in American Studies from NYU and a master's in African American Studies from Yale. And he's also ABD at Yale. So I want to welcome again, Chris and Carl. As you all know, we have a format where we either have a conversation or our guests do a presentation and we open it up for Q&A. Carl and Chris have decided to do take a more hybrid approach. They're going to tag team and do a relatively brief presentation, and then we will have a brief conversation before opening it up for Q&A. So get ready for that. You can begin adding your questions to the chat as soon as you have them. And as soon as we open it up for Q&A, we'll start knocking on your door. And as for questions, as always, please work to be as brief as possible so we can bring in as many folks as possible into the conversation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Carl for them to do their presentation, aided by our own Brian Welch.
Yay.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Smith. I really appreciate that introduction. I think I'm going to start it off and just kind of talking about Roca. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having us on here. I appreciate it, and it is such a privilege. And I love working with Carl, so it'll be a good tag team. So our mission is to be a relentless force in disrupting incarceration, poverty, racism by engaging young adults, police, and systems at the center of urban violence and relationships to address trauma, find hope, and drive change, excuse me. So part of that is we are who we work with. So we work with young adults and system partners at the center of urban violence. So our young people are 16 to 24 who really have experienced extensive trauma, who are primary victims and drivers of urban violence. They're involved in the criminal justice system, so they generally have low literacy, typically no high school degree or GED. They generally do not have any formal or sustained employment history. They're involved with guns, gangs, drugs, and they've dropped out of programs, schools, and jobs. So many of them are young parents. I know that Carl has almost 100% of young men that he works with that are involved in, that are parents from Dorchester, Mattapan, and Roxbury. In Western Mass, we have about 50% of our young people that are parents. And we also, we really work with the adults in the critical public systems that impact our young people and influence urban violence, such as public safety leaders, police officers, trial courts, judges, probation officers, court officials, correctional officers, DCF, prosecutors, defense attorneys. And to what end? Why do we do this? Well, we want to reduce incarceration, sustain employment, improve parenting, and we also want to demonstrate policy and practice changes for the high-risk young people.
Passing it on to me, Chris.
Oh yeah, sorry, Carl. Go ahead, Papa.
Yeah, tell me when you want to. Tell me when you want me to start sharing the slides.
Oh well, go ahead to go to the third slide. Sorry, Brian.
Go ahead and go to the third slide. This is amazing.
My apology.
I thought we were just going no slides. Like I was just like,
yeah,
we'll do no slides. Thank you, Brian. We'll go to the third slide, or the fourth one. Sorry. So I think I've worked in a lot of different organizations with the same target population. I actually started this work while I was a grad student at Yale. A close friend of mine who's actually now a scholar at Emory, he was like, given your experience with just your own life, you would be so great at this place called New Haven Adult Education. And I started working there as an outreach coordinator at this kind of special school, which meant that I would be going to people's homes, young people's homes, and just kind of trying to get them to buy into school. And that's how my journey started. And from there, I was a youth worker, a frontline youth worker, all this while I was trying to kind of navigate grad school and figure out what was important to me. And I think what's unique about Roca in relation to just my personal experience of having been kind of a disconnected young person and then having been a youth worker is that it has an approach that tries to adapt to just the adolescent brain. And so it's not really, Roca is not really one of the things that attracted me, let me say, to it is that it's not just, it involves mentoring, it involves employment, it involves the educational piece, getting young people connected to high-set education. It involves all those things, but it's really a behavior change organization. So if there's one thing that I want you to remember, whether you agree or disagree with the method, is that we're really trying to drive behavior change so that our young people can take better, so that they can just leverage the opportunities that we create for them a lot better. What we've learned, I think, or what's Roca's learned, I think, throughout its kind of 30 years, is that one can open up opportunities for young people. You can open up employment opportunities. You can open up educational opportunities. You can open up all sorts of different opportunities. But unless you really help that young person, help themselves change how they think, feel, and do about things, it's going to be really difficult to navigate. And if there's time, Chris and I were talking earlier, she can tell you about pre-CBT and kind of post-CBT organization. But what in view of some of the challenges of behavior change, in 2007, Roca partnered up with MGH to develop a curriculum that could address some of the challenges of the adolescent brain. And so MGH helped us to form a cognitive behavioral therapy curriculum that could help young people access their prefrontal cortex while they're experiencing just intense emotions in that limbic system. So just to kind of give you a sense of what I'm talking about, in this slide, if we look at this slide, the brain it's essentially divided into three regions. It's the brainstem, which is the survival brain, the limbic system, which is where many of our participants live. And that's the kind of where fight, flight, or freeze is at. And then there's the prefrontal cortex. And so what CBT essentially tries to do is to help young people move out of that limbic system and into that prefrontal cortex so that they can make better decisions. And some of those decisions may be about, you know, shooting somebody. Some of those decisions might be about dealing about an adverse experience with an employer. It can be a lot of things. But what I want you to remember about the brain is, and our relation to it, is three things. Number one, it's not fully developed until it's 26. Number three, it's composed of three regions, or number two. And number three is that due to the traumas in their lives, a lot of young people live in that limbic brain. And what we try to do through CBT is to actually help them access that prefrontal brain. And in moments when we're able to help them to access that, they're less likely to commit violence, they're less likely to engage in domestic violence, they're less likely to engage in adverse activities with their employers. Next slide. So CBT is essentially, you can think about it, it's very simply, the first part of it is understanding that every situation affects how we think, feel, and do, and creates what we call think, feel, do cycles, which can be negative or positive. So for example, if a young person is struggling with showing up to court dates or feelings of retaliation because someone disrespected or vandalized their friend's gravesite on social media, our youth workers don't necessarily tell that young person, the first go-to is not to give them advice or to be a big brother. The first go-to is actually to try to process that situation and make them aware of how they're feeling about it, what they're thinking about it, and what they want to do about it. And then the second part involves actually working with 7 skills in our curriculum. And we can dig a little bit into those skills, but if you go to the next slide, I can give you a more palpable example. And if you can tap through that, Brian. So here's a typical situation that a participant may present us with, or one of our youth workers, is getting called out on social media. Social media is like for young people right now, it's driving a lot of violence because it's 24/7, and young people that we work with, the target population, they're targeting each other through videos or by going into each other's neighborhood with guns and threatening each other. So a typical scenario might be that one of our young people was called out on social media. What the youth worker then does is, instead of saying, you know, you should just calm down, you shouldn't do that, we try to work through that think, feel, do cycle with them. And what that does, it just removes the youth worker from giving advice. And honestly, when any of us give advice, we're sort of the heroes of that advice. And so to remove that from happening, what we try to do is to try to listen more to young people. In essence, I would call just CBT a structured way of conversing with young people and becoming more aware of how they're thinking, how they're feeling, and what they want to do. So in this scenario, for example, you might have a young person that says, you know, the situation is getting called out on social media by, let's say, by their ops, by the opposition gang. And so we'll process, what do you think about that? Well, no one's ever going to disrespect me like that. That's messed up. I have to respond otherwise. Those are the thoughts. How are you feeling about that? Well, I'm feeling disrespected. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling determined. What do you want to do about that? Well, I want to get high and I want to go across town and shoot the person. And so that's what one example looks like. But I'll give you an example that just from 2 weeks ago. So a young person called my assistant director. He's had this young person for a long time. The young person works at Dunkin' Donuts. The situation was that his ops, an opposing gang member, showed up at his workplace, which is Dunkin' Donuts. So how was he feeling about that? He was feeling like running. He was feeling like getting his gun. He had his gun with him. And he was feeling like he was not, or I'm sorry, he was thinking he wanted to run. He was thinking that he was going to get his gun. And he was thinking that he was not going to die that day. What was he feeling? He was feeling anxious. And what did he want to do? He wanted to shoot. So then what the assistant director did was worked with one of our skills. One of our skills is act on your values. So the first is this person had been incarcerated for 18 months and values their freedom. And so making just them aware of their cycle and making them aware of their values in that moment where that other person is in the Dunkin' Donuts, super important. And then creating a plan. So making this young person aware of the values And then the plan was, let me get you an Uber, get you out of that situation so you can live another day, that other young person can live another day, and then we can process again later. And so that's a typical example of walking a young person through their think, feel, do cycle, using one of our skills to intervene, and then hopefully being useful to them, and doing this across a 4-year period that they spend with us. Our Roca program is 4 years. It's not 6 months because our young people are not the typical kind of young people that are in a fork in the road. They've already had multiple touch points with law enforcement. So a 6-month program is just, it's not gonna work if we really wanna help this population out. So in any case, this is a brief example. This is a brief example of CBT. So on average, every site, Baltimore, Boston, Springfield, Chelsea has on average about 175 to 200 young people enrolled. I ran the numbers for the last 2 quarters from July to December. And I was delighted when I ran this report because I don't typically run reports for other sites, but on average, about 65% of all the participants that are at our sites are engaged in cognitive behavioral therapy, which means that they're engaged in the structured conversation that is making them aware of how they're thinking, feeling, doing, and that is using skills, proactive skills, to get out of those cycles. So how do we measure whether this is effective? Every 3 to 6 months, we do what's called the change assessments to see if a participant is changing their perceptions about gang violence, their perceptions about substance use, etc. Is it effective? Anecdotally, I would say yes. But we're also working with apt associates to do an external evaluation of our CBT practice so that we can have empirical evidence about what's working, what's not working, and things that we need to adjust. Next slide, please. So what we do along with CBT is we work, or what we do along with trying to help our participants change their behaviors or change how they're feeling, thinking, doing about violence, so that they can take take advantage of opportunities that we put in front of them. We also work with law enforcement organizations because we're also trying to change how law enforcement organizations, be that probation, the DA's office, BPD in Boston, and Chris can talk a little bit more about the Springfield PD, but we're really trying to change how they think about young people and how they think about just giving young people a second chance. So Chris is going to kind of walk you through some of the engaged institutional work that we also do at Roca. And as she kind of tailors, I'll talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing with the DA's office, with probation, with BPS, and a number of other organizations in Boston. Chris?
Thank you, Carl. I also just want to kind of highlight, and Carl alluded to this just a little bit, about the pre-CBT at Roca and then the post-CBT at Roca. So I've been a part of Roca for the last 10 years, and before Roca partnered with MGH, it's important, anecdotally, I'll give you this example. We used to have young people and staff that just didn't really know how to regulate their feelings and figure out, kind of go from their bottom brain to the frontal cortex. And we used to have young people, being very destructive or emptying trash cans in the middle of town center, or just very explosive. I equate it to almost like WWE, and but now we very rarely have any. You'll have the occasional fight, but we rarely have any of those incidences. Mainly because the staff, we use CBT in everything that we do, from supervisions to just general conversations. And sometimes our young people also use CBT back on us, which is really awesome. So that we can tell it's working with even before we do the change assessments and able to see the data. But if you could switch the slide, Brian. So the engaged institutions and systems, Roca, one of the best, and this is one of the best quotes in this big green box, is we're only as strong as the relationships and the partnerships we build. And alone, we can't do this work. Those are two big pieces of, and it was Ta, who is the assistant director over there with Boston, and Carl's right-hand person, one of them anyways. But that is true. So Roca historically is kind of like community mobilization within the systems. We do a lot of analysis of the systems. We ask the systems to come together, and what does that look like? You know, we've been hosting a statewide criminal justice young adult group, which has trial court, CPCS, DYS, and Molly's been working with this group for quite some time, and some policy changes have come along, legislative changes have come along through this, but more importantly, systems changes. And she has challenged all of us directors regionally to kind of hold a group. So we regionally will hold a group, and in Western Mass, we've partnered with the Hampden County District Attorney's Office, and we hold a meeting. It's called the Young Adult Group. It's nothing crazy. And we have at the table, we have the local sheriff. So we have the Hampden County Sheriff's Department represented. We have the local PDs. So we have Springfield Holyoke represented. We have the regional DYS team, the trial court, so the probation, which is juvenile district and superior. And what has kind of come out of the young adult groups in terms of regionally is the sheriffs have committed to actually doing a young adult pod. And so what we did at Roca, we asked everybody to come in with all their statistics and said, okay, DYS, you present to the group, juvenile probation, you present to the group. And based on all the statistics, we asked a simple question: how can we do better for our young people in the age range of 17 to 24? And we presented the brain science, and we did restorative justice circles with this group. And what came out of it was a true systemic change. So in the Sheriff's Department, they are running a young adult group, or a young adult pod, if you will. And in this pod is only 18 to 24-year-olds. This is pre-COVID, of course. I don't know if Carl can speak to it, but I know locally they have not brought the pods back together yet, but it holds the 18 to 24-year-old young people. And the idea is that we will go in there as a provider, and we'll present with them. We'll do restorative justice circles. We'll also do a lot of our cognitive behavior therapy approach with them. And we'll go through our 7 lessons over and over again. And we'll run through them in various situations, much like Carl just did with you. And we'll give them all the tools in their toolbox. And what are the sheriffs seeing? They're seeing that a lot of the Class A violations, or the management is going down. So those young people historically are unfortunately, but it makes sense, they're usually the management problems in the pods. Whereas when they're together, they don't have the influence of the older crowd, but more importantly, they're able to almost police themselves, if you will, by using CBT on each other. Then the other cool thing that has come out of it locally is that the Hampden County DA has started a post-conviction young adult court. And we currently have 6 young people involved in that court. And it is high-risk young people. They're gun charges. They also have, we have gun charges, and we also have home invasion charges, excuse me. But they're all victimless charges, and so none of them have victims. If they do have a victim, it's generally a police officer, and they are actually stand in front of the judge and speak to the judge and say that this young person be a great, it would be awesome to have this young person involved. And then the other piece that Roca is doing is the hub and core. So they worked with the the Chelsea Police Department. They're working with Lynn Police Department, and now Springfield, and they've trained, we brought in individuals from Canada who are doing the hub and core. And basically what it is the police department is working with a bunch of different service providers, and they're able to bring up emergency situations. And then within 24 hours of that emergency situation, they're doing a group door knock where the police are not center, but maybe school department center, or maybe Roca's center, or maybe the hospital center. But they are basically, it's a team approach, and they're not just taking care of one individual, but it's a holistic, uniform approach around the family. And then more importantly, we're working with the trauma for police departments. Given where we are historically, and well, not even historically, but where we are currently today, we're doing a lot of police department restorative justice peace circles dealing with their trauma, just with the police departments alone. So Molly is currently working with Baltimore Police, doing that on a regular. We're working on with Springfield Police Department as well. So, and in addition, they'll come to our circle trainings. So I know that Carl can speak to Boston. I know they've done that, where the police and Springfield, Boston Police, whoever, will sit with our staff and our young people and go through a 3-day long circle training, which is pretty impressive. Because by the end of it, at the beginning, most young people and the police, they're really hesitant. By the end of day 2, they're dapping up. Again, this was pre-COVID. We're currently working on it. Molly is running a Zoom circle training as we speak. And so we'll be doing that as well coming in the future. So we are basically a community mobilization within the systems, and it's all predicated on relationship. It's all relationship based. So Carl, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that, and I think I'll start with just my experience of I think having been a youth worker at other organizations. I think what's unique about this organization is that behind the scenes institutional work with law enforcement partners to really try to change what they're doing. I think in other organizations I've been in, there's kind of skepticism of law enforcement, and it's rightful at times. It's just not always useful, because not all police officers or not all command staff are cut out the same way. And so in Boston, for example, I have an advisory board that has the Commissioner Forbes from DYS, Commissioner Dolan from probation, Chief Long, who's now acting commissioner of Boston PD, Anthony Benedetti, who's the chief attorney at CPCS. I have these people on my advisory board, and what that says to me is that they're interested in changing at a management level their organizations. And what all those partnerships do with me is it allows me to get to the granular level, to get to middle management, to get to their frontline workers, so that we could present about what they're doing, so that we can also get referrals from them, so that we can invite them to our peacemaking, restorative justice, peacemaking circles, so that they can get their staff to attend those circles, so that they can change their minds about who our young people are. And what's interesting about the peacemaking circles is that as different as young people think they are from law enforcement, and as different as sometimes law enforcement thinks they are from young people, there's just a lot of things that cut across our existence. Things like grief, things like death, things that bring joy. And so what those circles allow for is just a dynamic environment in which human connection can actually happen while we're dealing with thorny topics. So along with having my advisory board, some of the other institutional work that we've done at Boston, we work closely with Suffolk County House of Corrections. We used to be in their peace unit. That's the unit that before COVID, the unit that has young men 18 to 24. We've actually held a number of circles. We held a number of circles there during COVID, which was really rewarding. One involved both men and women. Just both very important things to do, especially in a time of social unrest and the pandemic. What else have we done? We also have a weekly meeting with the DA's office, with BPS, with the SOAR, with the Street Outreach Program for the city, with Youth Connect, which is another organization, on young people who are active and need to be referred to either SOAR or Roca. And it's actually the DA that convenes this, but it came after a set of dialogues with different organizations like ours and BPS, so that we could actually create a more collaborative approach to young people. And the meeting with the DA's office and BPS and DYS is a very unique meeting, because it deals specifically with 15 to 17-year-olds who are also driving violence and often in a more impulsive way. So I want to kind of move us on to the next topic, because I'm curious about some of the questions that everyone's going to have. But I think, Chris, you had a final.
I do, yes, you can. So this is our results framework. So basically, first of all, risk factors. So 70% of our young people have 6 or more high risk factors when they come into Roca. And generally what we do in the first 6 months, in the first 60 days, we're looking at eligibility. And when we do that, at least we have a mental health provider check in and do a mental health evaluation. So that's number one. Where do we get our young people? We get them through all our systems change, our systems in general. So we get it from street outreach. We get it from young people referring their friends. We get it from if there's a group of individuals hanging out on the street corner, we might ask them some questions and just do old-fashioned street outreach. But we also get them through probation or the judges or the police. Maybe they'll, we also look at all the arrest records as the weekly arrests or overnight arrests. So all of that, and then we also get them from the shooting. So if there's a shooting that happens in a specific area, we'll do some canvassing and we'll go to those homes, because a lot of times it's in areas that we know where our young people are. But this is our results framework. And in the first 6 months, we have, we're really just based on building relationships. There's not a lot more we're asking our frontline staff to do. We're bringing our young people, our hope is to bring our young people in and introduce them to everybody so everyone knows who they are, explain the roles. And then we will increase as they go through to the next phase. We're going to increase our engagement with them. It is our goal to have 2 face-to-face contacts minimum. Since COVID, we're trying to do 3. And a lot of times that face-to-face might be FaceTime, it might be Messenger, it might be Zoom. A lot of times with our COVID protocol currently in the last year, a lot of it is a combination of social media, FaceTime versus going out. But mostly when we do face-to-face, it's having them come out of their house. We'll meet them on the street, or we might meet them in other place depending upon safety. We do have some safety protocols in place based on how we evaluate them. So there's a lot of things that kind of go into the first relationship building piece. But as we move in, the other thing that differentiates Roca from most service providers is we're a 4-year program. And so in that first 18 to 24 months, we expect our young people to reoffend, to violate probation. A lot of times we will get individuals will say, oh, Roca, you must be doing a really great job because they reoffended. And well, of course they did. They're high risk. They need time to change their behaviors. It doesn't happen. Relapse. We expect relapse to happen. So basically what this framework is telling you is that, by the time it's 24 months into it, we're seeing emotional regulation. We're seeing demonstrated.
Did we lose audio?
Yeah, Chris, we can't hear you.
Chris, we lost your audio.
Yeah.
So I think I'll jump in here. And then I think so, but I think by 24 to 48 months, what Chris was saying is that we are expecting to see some emotional regulation, some behavior change. But I think, it's imperative to understand the context that a lot of our young people are coming from. By the time they enroll in our program, they're 15 or they're 17, and they've had a significant amount of trauma. And so sometimes that 24 to 48 months, it's going to be tough. It's going to be filled with relapse. It's going to be filled with a lot of hardship. and a lot of joy. And what we're hoping at the end is that, at the end of that journey with us is that we've been able to help our participants help themselves just lead beautiful but ordinary lives. I wanted to touch on one last thing, is just the DEI work that's happening at Roca. So I think a lot of organizations are looking inward, and we're no different in that regard. So we're using a framework called Awake to Woke, and Professor Smith and Winship would be happy to send you kind of materials to dig into that. But we're also reevaluating our recruitment and hiring procedures, especially as it relates to race and identity in the organization. We're doing cultural competency and implicit bias training. We've also done a compensation review, but we've not only made reviews, we've also made adjustments. And those are, just as a person of color, that's been incredibly important to see. So Roca is a work in process. We're certainly an adaptive organization. We're not necessarily stuck on whatever we believe. We're always looking for external evaluation to see what the strengths, the weaknesses, and the opportunities are. So with that said, thanks a lot for letting Chris and I present, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you now.
Thank you so much, Chris and Carl, for a really fantastic presentation. So there are a number of questions in the chat, and with the time that we have left, I fear if I were to ask my questions too, we might not be able to get everyone in. And so I think I will hold off on asking my questions until the folks in the chat get a chance to ask theirs. Perhaps Chris would like to ask a question or two before I open it up to our audience.
Sure. Could you talk a little bit about your funding and where it comes from?
Chris, you want to do that, or we can both do it?
Fabulous program. We just do it everywhere.
So, Professor Winship, I can't speak in too much detail about that because I just because I'm not involved in those things. Although I do show up to fundraising things, I'm not involved in the nuts and bolts. However, I'd be happy to set up a meeting with you, with our CEO or Molly, to get you that information. We are funded by private and as well and grants, state grants, national grants. But I can't give you details about that. I'd have to set up something with you and the CEO Scott, who's on here. Or with you and Molly, and that.
That would be great.
Absolutely, we could definitely do that. Plus, we see each other every Wednesday, so you can hold me accountable to that. I'll set that up for you. I promise.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm particularly interested in, I mean, I love your program and your expectations in the first 18 months, and I'm interested in finding out how you convince donors and funders. Those 18 months are going to be difficult. I mean, I was involved in a major program in the Boston Foundation, and the donors wanted, their idea was these kids should go to Boston College. They're going like, no, we should keep them out of, keep them drama and be involved in violent crime. But let's open it up.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think that brings up a good point. I mean, different donors, expectation of donors vary. I think there's an interest in, we work with young women, especially that kind of second generation. We didn't discuss that much, but I think there's a lot of interest in that as well by donors. I think, what Chris and I do is we share the real stories of, we share the real stories of a lot of what's happening. And that seems to capture some donors, but I'm not, in terms of like the nuts and bolts of, that kind of the development piece of Roca. I have the perfect person that you can talk to.
Okay, excellent. So why don't we start with Seema Gajwani? Would you like to ask your question, Seema?
Sure. I was just wondering if you mentioned that the CBT curriculum that you were using was specially developed for young people in your kind of cohort. And I was wondering if that was something that you made available for people outside of Boston or outside of Roca who are also working with um, similarly situated at-risk youth.
That's a great question. And I don't know if you're on yet, Chris, but I'll take a stab at it and then just jump in. We are starting to make the curriculum available through our Impact Institute, which is actually training the trainer, in essence, in these skills. And the skills were for the young people, but the CBT curriculum was also made so that any frontline or management staff, from myself to the middle management to the youth workers, could actually use that skill. So if you look me up online, I'd be happy to tell you about that institute. I'm happy to report that this is very new and it's very exciting. But I think our first or second cohort involved a lot of our Boston partners, involved partners from the Boston Police Department, from the Boston Public Schools Police Department, and from Suffolk County Jail. And they were all interested in training in the methodology. So that was pretty exciting for us, because what it suggested is that, for example, if you think about command or administrative staff at Suffolk County Jail and their use of CBT, it's all about de-escalation in that environment. How can you de-escalate yourself to not be impulsive with a young person or another person that's locked up? So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. I will be in touch.
Chris, do you want to say something? Your mic is off.
I don't think she can, but she did put in the chat that we are presenting CBT to law enforcement, and she just did a presentation at the Springfield Police Academy. So the knowledge is spreading. Is that right, Christy? Am I good? Okay. So next up is Diana Santil.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone.
I think I know.
Hi. Yes, you do. Sorry, I'm not showing my face right now. Well, how are you, Carl? Well, first of all, I commend you. I commend you for all the work that you're doing. But I know you guys mentioned that you focus on the CBT, and knowing that CBT is a top-down model, and though it's very effective, it doesn't really validate feelings or trauma-informed therapy. So, what other modalities do Roca leverage or employ to validate emotions and acknowledge trauma, especially adverse childhood experiences or chronic experiences that the youth often face? Because we do know that the trauma is stored in the limbic system. So if there's such a push to move from the limbic system without addressing the trauma, how does that help the youth overcome their situation?
I don't know that I would agree that it doesn't, and maybe you and I can do a sideline conversation. I don't know that I would agree with you that it doesn't, because it's really about listening to young people and moving the youth worker aside. So I wouldn't agree that it reinforces a hierarchical relationship of youth worker to youth, or that it doesn't necessarily acknowledge trauma. It's not what it doesn't do. It's not a therapy, because our frontline people are not therapists, and so they cannot do necessarily extensive trauma work with that young person. But what we can do is we can listen to that young person and to help them actually grow aware of some of their cycles, and then hopefully provide some skills that can help them in those negative cycles. Thank you, though. Thank you, Diana. And feel free to reach out to me. It's been a minute.
I will. It has been a minute. Good to see you. Continue the good work.
You too.
So next up is Jasmine. Jasmine, would you like to ask your 2 questions?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much. And thank y'all for just this wonderful presentation. Definitely felt like I've learned a lot, especially as someone who's been going to the hub meetings weekly and just getting a sense of what Roca is about. So I do research on approaches to issues of safety in Boston public housing. And, so my questions are kind of in relation to just some things that I've noticed so far. And so you gave the vivid example of and high-risk youth who was at work and a rival gang member showed up. And so something I've noticed in my research is that even youth who are not gang involved are also at risk simply from being outside in public housing developments, for example, and being targeted to send a message to the rival gang. And so is there any, are there any efforts to, partner with some of these other organizations or something in relation to trauma that's experienced within these communities where violence is high, right? Where people are afraid of just being outside and potentially being targeted just because of where they live. So that's one question. And you kind of already spoke to this, but if you could elaborate on how you identify youth to participate in your program, that would be appreciated as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think those are great questions and very true of like the places. Most of our young people are in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and most of them and just friends of theirs are experiencing what Jasmine is saying. So, I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do, Jasmine, is so I have a weekly meeting, not just I, but there's a weekly meeting with the DA's office, Roca, SOAR, BPS, DYS, and we're trying to figure out how to target youth that may be affected, that may not have been directly shot, but have been affected by that in the neighborhood. So the DA's office has a lot of technology that can help us to map out different neighborhoods where the shootings are happening, and then try to figure out how we can actually target some of those youth. But the thing is to do that systematically and then to develop the human capital to actually do that work. And often that's where it gets tricky. Because not every organization has the youth workers to actually send out. So that's something, what I'll say, Jasmine, is that it's in discussion, but there's no plan yet. But you're very right about those collateral effects. How we identify youth, we get referrals. The bulk of our referrals right now are coming from the DA's office, especially the juvenile unit. So the DA's office, Rachel has been very supportive, and she's a friend as well in the spirit of transparency. And the juvenile unit and Roca has worked closely for a long time, but we're also in this meeting, in this collaborators meeting. And so they've been sending us a lot of referrals because they're very interested in diversion and not locking kids up. The other referral source for us, the other referral sources are probation, BPS, sometimes community providers. Sometimes there's self-referrals if there's a family that may call. But we do try, like when we get self-referrals, that we do try to make sure that that young person has had multiple touch points with law enforcement, is gang involved, so that we're actually providing the intensive case management that's appropriate to that person. Thank you for your question.
Chris, are you able to speak with us now?
I hope, can you hear me?
There you go.
There you go.
Awesome. I had to, thank you very much. Sorry about that, y'all.
Not a problem. So Jasmine, have you asked your 2 questions? Can I move on to the next?
Yes, thank you so much.
Take care. So Lisa, Lisa.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for allowing us this opportunity to learn. I appreciate Christine and Carl very much in the work that you do. I am a wellness director for a teen suicide prevention program up in Nome, Alaska. And we also are trying to create a better relationship with our local police department, who are all white. And I could tell you that 100% of the people that they interact with are Alaska Native. So there are a lot of racial tensions in my region and in my community. We are about half white, half Alaska Native community. And so, yeah, we have a lot of difficulty around that issue. There's a lot of historical trauma. People are still trying to, they think it's historical, but really people are dealing with it every single day. So there's a lot of youth that we interact with that have been diagnosed with ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. You probably, all of you shaking your heads knowing about that diagnosis. but we're learning more about ADD every day and how ODD is actually, really tied to ADD. So we're trying to figure out if there are other programs out there that are screening. And Chris, you answered part of this during your presentation, which I appreciate. But we're looking now towards ensuring that the mental health practitioners that we are collaborating with are able to do screening for ADD and spectrum disorders, which out in rural Alaska is very, very hard to do. There are very few providers within the state of Alaska alone that are able to screen for those things. So I'm just wondering if you're seeing those kind of screenings more often with the collaborators in the mental health field.
Yes, so thank you, Lisa, for your question. What I can tell you is that we generally, Roca has been really good about partnering with whatever funding stream, whatever grant we have, partnering with behavioral health organizations, or entity or a hospital or whatever it is. So that is a key because very few of us, if any, I know I have one in my staff of 30 that is actually qualified to make a diagnosis or do actual licensed therapy. So with that being said, we are very good at making sure that there's experts that have a sense of what's going on. So in our young adult court, the DA makes it very clear that we have a behavioral health partnership. And part of that is, you want that collaboration. So the collaboration needs to be twofold. One, the CBT is just helping our young people, give them skills, and it's very practical, and it's something that we can 24/7. So a lot of our staff are 24/7. We have a Roca phone. We're always on it. We do try to teach boundaries with our staff, but most times it's 24/7. And I am part of that as well, and so is Carl. But the mental health side, it is up to us to always make sure that the young people are seeking treatment and making sure that we're following up, and we have a true, everybody's filling out the paperwork for releases. So you want to be as transparent as you can with the service provider along with the mental health provider. And so there's two things. Number one, I want to address the police and the racial tensions that you have. I do encourage you as an organization to really, restorative justice circles have done a world of good to breaking down perceptions and breaking down barriers and getting young people and adults to talk. It is a process. It's a long process. Generally, to be quite frank with you, you need to engage the police officers that have been on the job less than 5 years to really be part of that process. I found in the last 10 years, that's where I have the most bang for my buck to get those younger officers. Anyone who has been a police officer for a long period of time, by my experience, is not open to that. There's been a lot of trauma on that side, and they've been hardened to the job in many cases. So that is where I find that you have the most, where you're going to see the most change over time. The other thing I want to just express to the group, it took us 7 years to build a relationship with the local police department. It is not an instantaneous thing. There's a lot of mistrust that goes along across both sides of the aisle. Frontline staff, my frontline staff, look and come from the same streets and the same neighborhoods as our young people, as they should, because that's who is getting served. So with that, there's going to be some trust that our staff have to go, build trust over time as well. And we have to deal with our trauma within ourselves as service providers that we may have encountered with law enforcement or with any agency that we work with. So the foundation of Roca is restorative justice peacemaking circles. And I would preach that to any organization that is working with young people and working with systems that there's that trust that needs to be built over time. Thank you for that question. I hope I answered it to some respect.
So the next question is from Buana. Buana, would you like to ask your question? So if not Juana, how about Jeff Whiteside? Wow. Okay, Felix, I know you're on.
People are jumping off ship.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for a great presentation. This is really great work you guys are doing. I wanted to ask about whether you have faced any pressure from law enforcement agencies to share information about your clients as part of that back and forth relationship that you guys have in these regular check-ins, and generally what your policy is on sharing information with community partners. I ask this because I've been in situations where that piece has been the sticking point that basically prevented the police to service provider agency relationship from happening. They say there's this like specter of, you will know about a murder that's about to happen and not tell us. And because of this thing that may hypothetically happen, we are unwilling to engage with you unless you like commit preemptively to doing this. And if you have thoughts about how you managed to avoid that, if you did, or how you can bring people in without that back and forth. So anyways, thank you.
Yeah, so, absolutely. It's a great question. Go ahead, Chris, and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, no, I think both of us probably have similar and different experiences. I think so regards to, well, I want to say with regards to information, generally, they always want to know what set or what, what gang affiliation, et cetera. I guess my first reaction is it's a two-way street. We're not here to just service the police. The other thing is for safety reasons, there are some, let me just say this, long and short of it, I probably have 2 or 3 police officers that I would trust to have a conversation like that. To be completely honest, it is mandatory that you have that kind of relationship because, for instance, give you an example, we had there's a sergeant that's been working with me for 10 years and I trust him with my life and vice versa. And we were about to do a door knock with, and he called me and said, I don't know how you do it. You can't give us up, but I need you to get your staff out of there. It's a safety thing. A raid's about to go down. So from that perspective, from a safety perspective, it's very important to have that give and take relationship. From a perspective of just information gathering, it's a fine line that you really, it's a fine line. Carl?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you pretty much summed it up. So Felix, it's a fine line and we maintain that boundary. So I haven't, I mean, I'm relatively new to Boston. I've been here for 3 years. Luckily, I came at a time of reform. And so even with command staff, I haven't had, I get sent information. For example, I get sent information about like death anniversaries, gang violence, death anniversaries. I'm privy to information, but I haven't been pressured to release any information about our participants. I think from the get-go, at least since I've established relationships, there's an understanding of those boundaries and how those boundaries can complicate just their safety and ours. And so there are a handful of people that I trust wholeheartedly, but it's just the time hasn't come yet where we've had to kind of enter that terrain. What I will say about our relationship is I don't want to give the impression that all Boston police officers work with us. They don't, many do. Many just don't buy in. And Molly has this saying that you go where the open is. So, right. You know, to the, I can't remember the person from Alaska, but, you know, it's impossible to do this work with law enforcement and without law enforcement. And that relationship takes a long time to create because it involves them becoming to recognize some of their biases and some of their racism, and then it involves some of the other kind of maybe some of the other limitations of how we think about law enforcement. And so, but you go where the open is, and then you start to invite those officers, especially if you can get command staff to your restorative peacemaking circles, because if you can get one command staff person to come into that, they're going to be transformed. It's impossible to not be transformed just because right. You're going to share personal personal information about grief and loss and things like that that are going to connect you to the other humans there. And so it's impossible to leave that transformed. And please contact us if you want further information on what a peacemaking circle looks like. If you get a command staff person, you are likelier to then get their frontline officers to possibly attend. And those are the ones you really want. And then you are likelier to get specialized units like gang unit people and different things of that nature. But just to close the loop on Felix, no, we don't share information, and we don't go asking for it either.
So one real quick thing, Felix, I just want to say this. If you have the right police partners, they wouldn't ask you to do that. So they would understand the process and understand that what the change takes time over time. So that they wouldn't ask you to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that detailed response. And I think especially the information about the different levels of people you have to bring into the conversation. I think that's, in my experience, there have been like you find a person, but maybe it takes longer to penetrate further down to the units who might be actually doing these interactions. And, you know, your boss isn't watching you every hour of every day. So I think that perspective is useful. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up is Kathy. Kathy Rabeau?
Yep, sorry, just took me a moment to unmute. I apologize. You've answered this a little bit, but if you could talk a little bit more. Do you do anything? I guess I'm wondering, what is your reaction if someone in law enforcement or correction has done harm to an individual or covered up harm, like a specific individual in a specific individual? And do you acknowledge that? Do you encourage accountability, police change or practice in these situations? How do you, and I don't mean someone like George Floyd, because that's not local, but how do you handle it if it's been, they've been abused in DYS or they've been beaten up by a police officer? How do you handle that? How do you support them?
So I have a particular staff member who I've been working with for the past 7 years. And I say and he came to me one time and said, I really need to grow. I want to grow and develop. And I said to him, okay, well, part of growing and developing, we need to really work on the relationship with police and having you be able to work on that. And he was very, very adamant with me that that was a piece that he had a lot of trauma in. So we've spent the last 2 years working with him. And he found a therapist that was a former police officer. And he actually started talking with that therapist. And that therapist unfortunately went to academia, but he started to help him find another person to work with. So this individual really had to it took him about 2 years, but to work on that trauma. But the other piece is going back to those peacemaking circles, because it's important to have this individual in the circle training with us, because as a staff member, it validates the process, but it also opens up for the young people to trust the process, to speak to it. And you also need to, when you bring police officers into that circle format, you kind of, you say, I don't know what to expect, but just be open and trust the process. And it's going to get uncomfortable, but we're going to bring it around, and we were asking you to trust us. And by the end, they're dapping up. And again, like Carl said, we'll be happy to share all the information that we have about trainings but that whole process, whether it's Jericho circles, whether it's the Roca's peacemaking circles, there's a lot of different avenues to learn the process, but that helps.
I guess what I'm wondering is, would you ever work specifically with a police officer and specifically with the victim together, like dealing with the very not sort of, I mean, I work with youth of experiences, so that's why it's a little and like, do you actually get in there and work with helping that officer understand it, or the correctional officer or the DYS staff, helping them understand the harm that they've done?
So I have 2 examples, Kathy. One example is one of our youth workers picked up a young person, and they were profiled. They were pulled over. It was immediate. The young person our staff was kind of doing a roll, and the young person was a man of color, had his hoodie up, he got in the car, and they pulled him over. And it was clear as day that they were being profiled. The staff member came over, and he was livid with me. I called the sergeant who I was referring to earlier, and sergeant and his partner came. He actually expressed himself in a very boisterous manner to this officer, to the sergeant, and the sergeant heard him. He sat down, he heard him. They went and talked to that officer, and they came back and said, on behalf of the Springfield Police Department, we want to apologize. We handled it. He's going to get a reprimand. You were racially profiled. We're so sorry this happened. So that's one example. The second example, as quickly as it came, it fleeted, but there's multiple. But so I'm sorry, Carl, I don't know if you have another example or anything to help Kathy.
Unfortunately, Kathy, I don't have like an example that's kind of completely what kind of the scenario you're painting out. But what I would say is if I had a young person and there was sufficient evidence that a police officer had assaulted them, or done something like that, then I'd probably reach out to the command staff of that district and just have a conversation, and I'd initiate that way. Ideally, I would love to get that young person and that officer together in a smaller circle, just to because the idea of that is to use that to change minds. I don't want the young person to lock up and feel like all law enforcement officers are like that person, and have that police officer feel like whatever he was feeling at that moment was necessarily justified or justifiable in all cases. So that's how I would approach it. I would say I've had in a circle, I've had a DA that's prosecuted a young person, and that was really interesting. It's not the same scenario, but it just, different feelings were felt about that. And, it doesn't all end in rainbows, but there was a bit of a reckoning on both sides in that kind of restorative context. There was, I would say at least there was understanding.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I appreciate both your replies, partly because I appreciate your willingness to have it look at the officer too, and look at corrections and officers, because I just really appreciate that, because sometimes I've seen people talk a lot about, oh, the youth are traumatized, and the focus all becomes on them. So I appreciate your willingness to look at the other people too. So thank you very much for that.
Absolutely. And listen, one of the first things I did, and I encourage you all to do this if you get a chance, is to do a ride along with a police officer from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And, I got a chance to do that. And he's one of our partners. We did it in Mattapan, and I showed up at 11. He gave me his vest and he said, you can't say you're not a police officer. And he gave me a flashlight and he gave me handcuffs. And I sort of knew that it was real at that point. And then we faced some very interesting things that I can go into detail in another time. But I would encourage everyone to do that, just to get a glimpse, because sometimes it's a very charged scenario, is what I can say. Sandra or Professor Smith, back to you.
No, Sandra's good. So the next up is Diane Serpina.
Hi, thank you. So my question is about your Young Mothers program and what the needs and issues are that you're facing with the young women, and whether that has impacted the model that you use at Roca when you're dealing with gender-specific issues. And what does work with these young mothers?
Thank you, Diane.
No, I was just going to say, unfortunately, we don't have a Young Mothers program in Boston yet, so I'm going to defer to Chris.
Yes, so thank you. I will say that it was, so I did 7 years with just the men's program, and when the women came in, I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. 30 moms is about 200 men. So it was a lot of trauma, unfortunately. Domestic violence. A lot of our young mothers are also their children's fathers are oftentimes in the gangs or in the streets, but it's a lot of resilience as well. So I have to say that. So the single moms and the young moms, we spend a lot of time getting very acclimated to all the services around that, which is DCF. You know, it's very sad. We were having a party one time and there was an emergency removal at our party, which we were like, what in the world? So that was traumatizing in itself to staff, but more importantly, this is what our young mothers go through. And so navigating systems was a game changer for us, but the domestic violence unfortunately has increased, especially since COVID. So we've been there's a lot of safety measures around that. In addition to that, Department of Transitional Assistance has been actually very wonderful working with and navigating. So working with our young moms, just trying to help them get gains. And the most important thing that we did with regards to Department of Transitional Assistance is that DTA recognized that, you know, Roca has a training program. And so anyone who has DTA, and this goes for men and the moms, anyone who has DTA, they have usually their cap, but they allow Roca check for $500 to not go against their DTA services, which is awesome. So that kind of that helps with the cliff effect. But what we see, unfortunately, is a lot of domestic violence trauma, a lot of substance abuse trauma, and it just, in general, a lot of resilience. And these moms are awesome to work with. And but yeah, it's mostly around that.
Okay, so we definitely have time to get in one question. Whether or not we can answer it in the time is another question. And that is from John Rhoda. And if you might be willing to stay for another minute or two, maybe we can get Kevin's question as well. So John?
Hi, everyone. First, just tremendous job you guys are doing. I'm a little familiar with it with my friends out in Springfield. I'm in law enforcement. I just want to hit on a couple points. The Dunkin' Donuts scenario you guys gave up early in the talk. I love the how you took it from incarceration to freedom, and you gave freedom value, and that seemed to change the whole dynamic of that situation, because a lot of times incarceration, when somebody's been incarcerated and that fear of loss of freedom comes in again, it turns into desperation and violence. So that to me is like the essence of kind of what you guys are all about, just having that conversation. The other thing I wanted to bring up is older officers. I'm one of them. I tell the young guys what to do, so that's a good thing. So we can get that stuff. But I think that the in-service training and exposing police officers to this type of thought process, because this is a great, it's what we teach our children. It's sit, think about what you're doing, you know, think, feel, do, which you guys are training. So that's tremendous. The in-service training and the academy training, I think that's the best way to get it out there, out into the street. The other thing I would just suggest to you folks is if you have any type of prepackaged training, we're doing so much online training now that it's very common for us to come in and just find a little note that we have to review something. And I think this is something that your rank and file officers could come in and as part of their normal duties, review it. But I think it's tremendous. The only other question I had, because you answered mine in the queue, was when you bring groups together, what are the largest amounts of people you'll have in one session? Because I know you do a lot of one-on-one.
Yeah, so go ahead, Chris.
No, you got it, Carl. Go ahead.
No. Well, so for Boston and Springfield, given kind of the sizes of our buildings, that could be different. But you know, a peacemaking circle of about 20 to 30 people is sufficient, because because you're going one person at a time. Some people speak longer than others, and it can be longer, or it can just take longer than expected. But I do, you know, our Impact Institute is really working to do some of that training that you're suggested, some of that prepackaged training, because I think that we really see, we're seeing, you know, when I reached out to partners in the Boston Police Department, in the DA's office, at BPS Police, at probation, about the CBT training that we were going to do, I wasn't sure of I wasn't sure of how receptive everyone was going to be. And then I was flooded with everybody wanting to go to do it. And that was just, not only did that make me feel good about the nature of our relationships, and also the fact that people wanted to learn de-escalation skills for those dynamic contexts, but it made me see that there's an area here there's an opportunity here. There's a gap here that we can help to fill with some good knowledge of how to operate in dynamic environments. So it's something we're definitely looking into. Chris?
Yeah, so I would say that right on, 20 to 30 is on point. And I know Molly is working on, like I said, a Zoom circle training, learning how to do it over Zoom. And I'm excited about it because I love circle training process because, you know, John, you're right on. There are probably a handful of older officers who are the decision makers, rank and file, who definitely believe in this process. And those are the ones that we need because, like Carl alluded to, the rank and file make sure that the other officers go. So when we do circle training and it's for the community policing, well, as soon as you come out of the academy, your first run is community policing. And then, so they make them come. So a lot of times they're like, I don't know, my sergeant told me to be here, you know, and I'm getting overtime or whatever. And that's okay. But by the end of it, they're seeing our young people who are working in the streets on, you know, with their Roca sweaters on. They're like, hey man, how you doing? You're doing a great job. Because oftentimes they ask, what can we do? And we're like, well, when you see him, say, do a good job. Or when you see him not doing a good job, you know, hem him up, but call me and say, hey, if you're not at Roca on Monday, I'm gonna take this dime bag and process it. Otherwise, go to Roca. And they follow up with me and say, did they go? Yeah, they went. Great. All set. So those are the things that the Institute is working on, all of that, because Molly wants to get it to everybody. And so that's part of it. They're working on it.
Great job.
Okay, I think that's gonna do it for us tonight. We are over time. Thank you so much, Carl Miranda and Chris Judd, for joining us and sharing with us what is happening at Roca. I'm gonna bring you back when you have results from the ABT Associate Study to find out more about what the data actually tell us is going on there. This is fascinating stuff, really good work. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. Gabriella, I also know Gabriella. It's a small world.
It is a small world.
Yeah, so I know her. Congratulations. I don't know if she's still on. And Professor Winship, I'll get you that meeting, and I'll see you next Wednesday.
Thank you, everybody. So privileged. Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.